Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Wednesday digital discussion with the John Quincy Adams Society. I am Patrick Fox, a program assistant and Northern Regional Director of the Society. Tonight, we will be speaking with Lyle Jeremy Rubin, author of Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body, a Marine's Unbecoming. Lyle Jeremy Rubin was deployed to Afghanistan in 2010 and has since earned his PhD from the University of Rochester. Welcome, Lyle Jeremy Rubin. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. So, just to sort of get started, not everyone has gotten the chance to hear about your experience. In your book, you describe how your experiences in the armed services in Afghanistan transformed your view of America's role in the world. What led to your initial decision to join the Marines?
So I guess the most immediate catalyst for my decision to join the Marines was 9/11. I was 2 weeks into my freshman year of college, and I walked into the student union that morning, and there was already, hundreds of people crowded around a large white screen that usually wasn't there, with Wolf Blitzer's face, blazed across, and one of the towers had already fallen and the other one was about to fall. So everyone screamed when we saw in real time the second tower fall. So that left quite an impact on me. I didn't come from a military family. I didn't come from a military town. I didn't do junior ROTC. I wasn't doing college ROTC. But I did have my grandfather, who was a Marine. He fought in the Pacific, and he actually got shot in the head in Iwo Jima. And he managed to survive despite a lot of his dear friends dying in that campaign, specifically in Iwo Jima, and raised a family, had a metal plate for the rest of his life in his head. And he was always a hero of mine, but it wasn't until 9/11 that I thought seriously about maybe following in his footsteps.
Absolutely. And so once you actually began training, you write about how your experience interacting with Marines from a diversity of backgrounds was really impactful. How did your experiences in training change your views about the role of the military in American society?
So, there's a lot of different levels in which I can respond to that. And I try to operate at many different levels in the book itself. So, at a very kind of basic strategic level, what was most shocking to me is this naive, true believing kind of neoconservative type, young buck entering the Marine Corps was just the drastic gap in the rhetoric, the kind of idealistic rhetoric of the time about bringing democracy and freedom to the greater Middle East, and at that time, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the actual military culture. Military culture is all about kill, kill, kill. It's all about dehumanization, to the extent that you learn about counterinsurgency and you learn about winning hearts and minds. It's always kind of an afterthought or a footnote. The overall energy and mood of that type of space is totally contrary to any kind of nation building ideal, much less, a freedom loving, democracy building mission of any kind.
On exactly that note, actually, I wanted to talk about how you write a little bit how being an officer, there was a little bit of a division between you and the enlisted people who you were entrusted with supervising, to the point where you felt a little bit powerless sometimes, especially when some enlisted soldiers felt at war with Afghan civilians themselves. Do you think that the system of empire benefited from or even counted on this lack of supervision and lack of control?
Yeah, so just real quick, I had a strange course that I took in the military. At first, I tried to become an officer. I didn't make it through the first time, and then I went to boot camp. So I was an enlisted Marine for a year and a half, and then I went back to officer candidate school. I became a signals intelligence officer. So by the time I made it to Afghanistan in 2010, which was the height of President Obama's surge, and I was in the Helmand province, which is the main effort. I was just north of the main effort, which was Marja at the time. By the time I showed up, it was it was a very violent battle space that I was in. And in answer to your question, I think that's kind of, I think your question implies that there's this imperialist history and imperialist culture that U.S. troops are bringing with them whenever they step foot in a foreign country, and even stepping foot within, formal, U.S. borders. I would say that culture and that history is still very present, and I think ultimately very harmful. Both, most of all to the people that are being policed or warred against, but also to the American U.S. warfighters themselves. And just to kind of add a more kind of concrete element to this, this is one of many anecdotes I can tell, but I do tell about training in general. Is after World War II, there was a famous study that came out that was done by a general named S.L.A. Marshall, and he concluded the overwhelming majority of frontline troops during World War II, he was speaking specifically about U.S. and British troops, didn't fire directly at the enemy. They either didn't pull the trigger at all, or they fired to the left or the right of the enemy, above the enemy, below the enemy. So this was obviously considered very inefficient from the perspective of military brass and civilian leadership. So they introduced measures that had always been in place in militaries throughout history, dehumanizing measures, but they really perfected this new training regimen. So by the time I showed up at boot camp in 2006 at Parris Island, it's a very well-oiled machine at this point. So we're learning how to use a bayonet. The last time a bayonet was used was the Korean War. It was 1953. So we were not issued bayonets when we went to Afghanistan. My friends who went to Iraq were also not issued bayonets, but we spent hours on end learning how to use a bayonet. And it had nothing to do with learning how to use a bayonet. It had to do with dehumanizing these groups of people. I would argue these colonized groups of people that we would be policing and oftentimes trying to kill or killing in one way or another. And anyways, with this training, we would just do this for hours on end. We would say, kill, 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 Haji, kill, 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 Haji, kill, 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 Haji. And we would have our rifle with the bayonet at the tip. And the term Haji, for anyone who is not aware, is a term of respect among Muslims. It means one who makes the holy pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. Obviously, we use that term not only in entry-level training, but throughout our Marine Corps careers, and particularly once we made it to Afghanistan, as a derogatory term, much like other derogatory terms that have been used in all wars. But that's just one example of this kind of imperialist. Now, obviously, you could say this is like any kind of war mindset, but I think I would argue that the U.S. military, by virtue of being the most powerful force in the world, and by virtue of having a history of either colonizing people, across Northern America, or constantly invading and occupying other countries. You could go all the way back to the U.S. Mexican-American War in the 1840s. You could move forward to the real moment of the rise of American empire with the Spanish-American War and the taking of the Philippines. And a long, really brutal occupation in the Philippines. This in turn led to a pretty vicious control over all of Central America. It became known as the Banana Wars. So I could go all the way through to the Vietnam War. I could go on and on. But the training that you endure and that you absorb as a foot soldier for an empire, I would argue, is more intense, more dehumanizing, more vicious than in most other militaries. And the overall mentality and mindset in which you're operating, is very much of that kind of, it's a mindset of domination, effectively.
It's interesting that you use the term foot soldier, because more recently, we're seeing some newly adapted forms of counterterrorism, notably this new term, over the horizon aerial strikes. Do you think that this is any sort of meaningful change in America's role in the world, or would you say that this is, how would you interpret this new type of language and how we use American weapons?
So there's a great book, which I'm sure you've heard of, Sam Moyn's Humane, which is a kind of a history of mostly figures in Europe and the United States trying to construct more humanitarian forms of war that they could then kind of justify indefinitely. This move to drone warfare, and also to kind of like small footprint special forces operations, is another chapter in this story of so-called humanitarian war. So I think the first thing I would say about that is, when Sam Moyn was writing his book, I mean, it looked like somewhat plausible that we would be moving very rapidly to a reality in which you didn't have many conventional forces on the ground anywhere. And it was mostly drone wars, cyber warfare, and then occasionally special forces operations that would be going on at any given moment. But then Russia invaded Ukraine. And now you have, not only a conventional war, but a pretty catastrophic one, and one that we haven't seen in Europe in quite a long time. So I think that just speaks to the unpredictability of all this. It's easy to make this kind of case at some points, and then at other points, suddenly the argument you're making or the kind of utopian, future that you're putting forward no longer seems as feasible. But even with that said, I mean, drone warfare, I think there's a case to be made that drone warfare isn't any more humane. That in fact, that distance that's created makes it much easier for people to pull the so-called trigger than it is to do it when you're actually on the ground and the people you're aiming at, are within, you can see them, or you can, you have a sense that they're somewhat near you. And I think if you look at those who study drone warfare, they're constantly coming out with new reports showing how many of the actual people getting injured or killed by these strikes are civilians. So I would push against the very assumption that drone warfare is more humane. And of course, all these drone operations are accompanied by special forces on the ground. And there's, again, a long history and quite a lot of research out there showing that special forces are also quite indiscriminate as far as who they end up targeting, or who ends up getting killed or injured in their own operations. So, I am not someone. I'm not a booster of this supposed or posited turn to more remote kind of small footprint warfare. I think there's a lot of reasons to doubt, A, that it will actually happen, and B, if it does happen, that it will be nearly as humane as many think. And I think, Sam Moyn's point in his book is that we've already seen that the introduction of these new tools doesn't so much discourage war, or discourage he would concede that at times it might discourage the worst excesses of war. I mean, you see less kind of person to person, very intimate forms of war crimes and such. But it also incentivizes war as a whole, because it's much more remote, it's much more abstract, and the costs, at least for the on the side of the military that's stronger, the imperialist power, the great power, are much smaller. So in a way, it kind of guarantees the situation, unfortunately, that we're already in, with, this endless war where there's just operations taking place all over the place. And there's only a tiny handful of reporters and journalists that are, covering these operations. I mean, I can name the amount of journalists that are covering the U.S. presence, military presence in Afghanistan on one hand, at least the English-speaking journalists. And that's not enough journalists to be covering the amount of violence that the U.S. military and its allies and proxies are currently imposing across that continent.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just again for our audience, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. I do additionally want to talk about one type of way in which we're sort of exporting conflict as opposed to doing it ourselves. That distance that America seems to seek in its new counterterrorism programs, sort of in the form of arms deals to overseas partners. How do you think that this new practice relates to the role of American empire? Certain reports are talking about proxy forces and other. I'm curious to hear your take on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always been proxy warfare has always been an essential aspect of warfare, particularly great power warfare, imperial warfare, colonial warfare. I will say that the global arms trade, which is very much being led by the United States, keeps growing, much like the U.S. military budget as a whole. And in fact, there's a direct relationship between the growth of the military budget and the growth of the global arms trade. A lot of the money that the U.S. is committing every year to our supposed defense is actually going directly into the pockets of defense. Basically five major defense contractors, and they're making most of their money just selling these arms to a lot of horrible governments and horrible proxy organizations around the world. And not only is it horrific just to think that there's all this money, you're talking about the tune of trillions of dollars that could be used for socially beneficial projects, particularly in an age of climate crisis and radical inequality. This is all being redirected to the coffers of the already very wealthy. I mean, it really amounts to a very an upward redistribution of wealth. So that's horrific in itself. But of course, a lot of these weapons, the more these weapons get flooded, or the more these weapons flood different regions of the world, the more they end up getting used. So they end up encouraging the very violence that the U.S. claims to be attempting to prevent or mitigate, so on and so forth. So I don't think it's so much a difference of kind as a difference of the intensity of the kind of arms trades and proxy wars that have always been here have just gotten a lot worse.
Absolutely. And I want to tie this back a little bit more to your own experience. Your time in Afghanistan seems to have been something of a breaking point for the neoconservative views that you joined the military with. What would you say, if anything, was the primary thing that changed your mind?
You're talking about like the war and just my view of
sure, yeah,
U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
So I try in the book, I think there's kind of a cliche among anyone, among military memoirs in general, particularly the more thoughtful, critical kinds, that, there's this moment in Afghanistan or whatever country the veteran finds himself in where they suddenly become disillusioned. There's this kind of negative eureka moment. And at least for me, and I think for a lot of people, it tends to be a lot more gradual. I think, again, military culture itself can be a very disillusioning experience for a lot of people. Most people that enter the military don't even end up in a war zone, never mind actually experience combat. And yet you have a lot of people in the military, most of whom have not been in a war zone, and have not experienced combat, who are profoundly changed by their military experience, and oftentimes in ways that could be described as disillusioning or discouraging or destabilizing. And I think that's, I think the military itself, all militaries are incredibly there. It's a radical thing to join an organization whose primary purpose is to kill other people, police and kill other people. So that culture in itself is necessarily going to change a lot of people in all sorts of ways. And unfortunately, a lot of times very, sad and ugly ways. But on top of that, again, if you're fighting on behalf of a power like the US, that is responsible for just so much, oppressive, power relations around the world. And I mean that both at a micro level, like when I was going on foot patrols, there were farmers who were, farming. A lot of them were picking poppy and so forth. But, they were terrified of our presence, and for good reason. I mean, a lot of times they had been witness, or someone they knew had been witness to all sorts of violence that was being unleashed by, our military or those we were allied with. And a lot of them had lost family members or friends. So that at a very micro level, that kind of a relation where they are effectively, the people living there are effectively at the mercy of these young kids with, very powerful weapons, is, that in itself, it can be very dispiriting, or it can lead to all sorts of forms of disillusion. But on top of that, at a more macro level, what is the U.S. military's actual function in the world as a whole? And ultimately, I would argue that it's to enforce certain status quo power relations in the world, whether it's making sure that the U.S. remains the dominant force in the world and certain parts of the world. In my case, it was the greater Middle East, maintaining control of certain markets, having access to relatively cheap resources, relatively cheap labor, relatively willing consumer bases. It's the more you study that actual system, that actual structure, it's hard to walk away denying that this is an incredibly oppressive global world order that the US is in charge of. And I think thoughtful people that have won the uniform, who do end up studying these broader structures, not only become disillusioned from their own kind of interpersonal experiences on the ground, but from kind of these structures that were rendered invisible before they put on the uniform, before I put on the uniform, suddenly are everywhere. If that makes sense.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. One thing I really want to mention, because I think you have a really interesting approach to this. You in your book, you talk a lot about sort of this duality of manhood in the military's internal culture, both this obsession with self-defense, and also like an appeal to an inherent strength. Can you talk a little bit about that, and specifically just how manhood relates to part of this Marine identity?
Sure. So I argue, in more or less that life is to a large degree trauma, that we're constantly being either threatened or experiencing, various forms of violence or abuse, verbal abuse, or we're just experiencing all sorts of micro tragedies on a regular basis, particularly as a child. I mean, as a child, you're especially helpless. And, I felt like I had to write about my own childhood in order to make this argument effectively. Or in fact, I would argue that the argument kind of emerged from telling my own story. But I think a lot of young people, particularly young boys, end up convincing themselves that the way to protect themselves from these threats, from these traumatic experiences, is for them to become manly in very conventional ways. Either it means going to the gym and getting bigger. It could mean joining the military and learning how to use an M4 rifle. It could be adopting a very kind of chauvinistic politics. So there's a lot of ways to kind of achieve this conventional masculinity or manliness. But I think what all these different paths share in common, aside from this need to feel secure, is this kind of ethos, which I think goes back to the title of the book, Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body. This idea that the more pain one ends up giving and taking, the more one becomes a man. So it's this fetishization of pain itself as kind of the one's ticket to manhood and one's perpetual ticket to manhood. And you can see this across our culture. I mean, at the far, the most obvious, I think the most obvious wing in the kind of political discourse that you see this is on the far right, where it's just totally a politics of this almost cartoonish manliness, where everything that's said, everything that's done is just trying to constantly prove that you're more manly, you're harder than the guy next to you. But I think there's this kind of bipartisan, hyper manliness when it comes to our foreign policy. I think whether you're Democrat or Republican, the way we talk about international relations, the way we talk about our relationship with other governments and other leaders, it's very much in this masculine vernacular. You always have to prove that you're strong. You have to encourage confidence, often by sending a Hellfire missile this or that way, or if there's if you're attacked in any way, or even if you're threatened, you need to respond not only in kind but usually disproportionately. So yeah, I mean, I can go on and on about this, but I think that I think it's so at this point, it seems to me anyway that it's just such a, what was once subtext has become text, and this masculine vernacular I'm talking about is really just, it's everywhere.
Absolutely. One of the writers that you cite in the piece, Ta-Nehisi Coates, he had a really interesting phrasing for this, which is being both the victim and the victor. Are there any ways in which any examples of ways in which you sort of see this dimension in U.S. foreign policy today, in more recent, even Biden administration?
Sure. I mean, well, one example, right. So one example is when the Biden administration, formally withdrew from Afghanistan. You had, you had the bombing in and around the airport in Kabul. And the knee-jerk response from Biden and his foreign policy team was to send a drone missile into Kabul. And then, of course, this goes back to what I was saying earlier. It turned out that the drone ended up killing a number of civilians, including I believe he was an aid worker. But at the time, the Pentagon, declared victory after this drone operation, saying that we got one of the terrorists who was complicit in the attack on the airport. And it turned out to be just a total lie. I mean, the New York Times, did pretty, incredible report, almost immediate reporting. They came out with a long expose, I think within a week or two, or a few weeks of the actual drone operation. But in any case, I mean, that's one example of just, it was a totally, I mean, in retrospect, it was this totally irrational response. I mean, how would dropping another bomb in Kabul end up defending anyone at this point? Much less the American people. And in fact, I mean, if you want to think rationally about the situation in Afghanistan, you have the Taliban, which is a horrific government. And we've already seen, they've already worked to take away whatever women's rights were granted, at least in Kabul. Most Americans don't realize the overwhelming majority of the country, a lot of those types of rights, those civil and political liberties were actually lost many years ago, because the Taliban had either formal or informal control of a good chunk of the country well before the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But in any case, the Taliban is actually their major adversary at this point are not liberal Western humanitarians. It's more violent, more radical forces to their right, that drone bomb and the overall posture of the United States military to the Taliban government, particularly when it comes to freezing Afghanistan's reserves. I mean, there's $7 billion that is the property of the Afghan government, particularly the central bank in Afghanistan, that has been effectively stolen from them by the U.S. and allied European powers. And this is basically empowering the most, radical forces in that country, that have far more abhorrent plans than whatever the Taliban's doing right now. So I think at a rational level, if the goal is to, try to discourage a total kind of moral or humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, this very kind of punitive mentality is precisely what we shouldn't be indulging in. Just to be clear, the assets that we froze has already led to a humanitarian crisis. I mean, particularly during the winter now, there's a lot of homeless Afghans that wouldn't be homeless if the government had, and by the way, the central bank is the most independent part of the entire government. I mean, it's the one part of the government that actually does seem to have some interest in ensuring, economic and social stability in that country. And they would have been the ones in charge of deciding where this money went to a large degree. And it would have, you could argue that some of it would have been redirected toward, Taliban-minded ends. But there's no doubt, among experts that if they had this money, you'd have a lot less homeless people. And there's actually a lot of people that are starving in that country right now that wouldn't be starving. And again, this is all empowering the most radical forces in that country, because the Taliban is failing to provide the most basic social securities for their people, which is just opening the door for ISIS. When I talk about the most radical forces, I'm mostly talking about what's effectively ISIS in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. And, so it's quite clear that our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been disasters. And actually coming up on this 20th anniversary of our war in Iraq, do you think that there's a real threat of revisionism? People trying to rewrite the story to say that we shouldn't have withdrawn from Afghanistan, or do you think that there's a real worry about people rewriting history different from how it was experienced?
Yeah, normally I would be worried about that. But it seems like we've reached a point now where media is just so oversaturated with news, with stories, and the entertainment complex is so oversaturated with endless forms of entertainment that there's almost no longer even a need for such histories to be rewritten. People are operating, with basically tadpole memory. If it happened any longer than 5 minutes ago, then it didn't happen. This sounds very despairing, but in my own interactions with people, I think most of them have already forgotten about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. There was certainly a type of rewriting that was happening among, mainstream media in the immediate wake of the withdrawal. Basically pretending that everything was going fine until the withdrawal, and just totally erasing, the countless lives that were being lost as a result of that occupation and as a result of that war. Just to recommend another writer to everyone, Anand Gopal, has been, in my mind, the most important reporter when it comes to the war in Afghanistan. And I would recommend his book, No Good Men Among the Living, which gives a really important history of America's war since 9/11, and gives a little backstory to the 20 years of war that preceded it. But he's also written a number of very, just incredibly affecting reports for the New Yorker. And there was one report in particular, I think it was called the Women of Afghanistan, that came out a few months after the withdrawal. And the point he was making is that, for all the Taliban's, crimes, the fact is, for most of the countryside, they're experiencing some level of peace for the first time in 40 years. And it's one of the reasons most of the people on the countryside were unwilling to fight on the side of the coalition government, the U.S. supported government, because they were tired of war. And most of them weren't very optimistic and remain not very in my sense, at least from all the reporting and polls that I've seen. Most of the Afghans, I don't think, are enthusiastic supporters of the Taliban, but they at least had the hope, rationally so, that the Taliban would at least lead to the end of the war. And for all the starvation and homelessness that I'm talking about, at least according to Gopal, at least that aim has been achieved to a large degree. I actually forgot the original question. So just remind me, because there was a second part of this that I think I wanted to.
Yeah, just the threat of revisionism,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the point is that this was all the fact that this country was actually at war, that this war was being led and maintained by the U.S. and its allies, was totally erased immediately after the withdrawal. It was this idea that basically all of Afghanistan was the green zone. All of Afghanistan had free women that were going to school and doing professional work. And that simply wasn't the case. 80% of the population lived and still lives in the countryside. And the majority of them were still very much experiencing a war. The majority of the women had already lost whatever rights they had, that they had gained, immediately after the U.S. occupation in the early 2000s. But to my original point, that kind of revisionism it didn't need to be repeated. It did its, it did its ideological work for the few months after the withdrawal, in the sense of, Biden was sent a very clear message from both basically the military industrial establishment as a whole, including the media, that this is, you will be punished for behaving this way. And the message was sent. But as far as the public as a whole, I think they've already forgotten, they've not only forgotten the war, they forgot the withdrawal that just happened, fairly recently. I don't even know if there's a need. I think it's more just kind of just saturating the discourse and media and our culture as a whole with just total nonsense. There's no longer, that's kind of the real cheat code to, again, this sounds very despairing, but I think that's the real cheat code to kind of maintaining the status quo, is just having people just kind of debating nonsense all day. There's no need to rewrite the histories anymore.
Well, speaking of nonsense, the whole concept of tadpole memories among the American consumer. You wrote a great piece back in 2019 on columnist Max Boot and sort of his efforts to rebrand himself as the Democrats Republican, and the kind of person who can be listened to. How do you think the Blob might be preparing for another bout of primacy, even after 2 decades of forever wars?
Well, clearly, I mean, they're trying to. There's part of the kind of militaristic crowd that is hoping the war in Ukraine can be that kind of source of imperial renewal. At a very elementary level, profits are already recovering, from the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the kind of like informal end of the war on terror as a result of the invasion of Ukraine. There's just a lot of money that's now being made with all the arms that are being sent to Ukraine. I personally, as someone who served on the occupying, invading side of an imperial military, my heart always lies with those people that are being invaded or occupied. And I don't think it's enough to say my heart lies with them. I think you have to show real solidarity with them. And, I am not opposed to arming the Ukrainians. I think we're at a point now where we seriously have to, I expect more from my government and European governments at this point to explain how this war is going to come to a close, because I'm also aware that the longer any war persists, the harder it is to get out of the war, and the more it just ends up tearing up not only the society in the country that the war is taking place, but often the entire region. There ends up being all sorts of regional effects that can be terrible. So, when I'm talking about the military industrial complex profiting from the arming of Ukraine, I just want to make it clear, I'm not saying that therefore they shouldn't have been armed. I have a lot of friends of mine that don't think they should have been armed or should stop being armed. And I think that's a fair argument that should be put forth in a healthy democracy. But in any case, again, I'm so sorry. It was a long day at work. So what question am I answering right now?
No worries. I'm just wondering a little bit about the Blob and how they may be preparing for the next.
So Ukraine is one space that a lot, at least directly the defense contractors, the defense firms, all their consultants. That's one place that they're looking as an opportunity as the next stage. But of course, I mean, if you're looking at the kind of global power dynamics as a whole, Russia is, a second tier, kind of decadent post-imperial power. And really, if you're from the perspective of the militarists, the real bang for your buck, I apologize for that pun, or maybe the pun's intended, but the real bang for your buck is going to be with China. And I think, that's really, to the extent we talk about a new Cold War, I think it is, unfortunately, we're already seeing it, really shaping up to be about, China. And basically the U.S. foreign policy establishment since World War II has been determined not to allow any other great power to achieve, parity with the U.S. And I don't just mean that militarily, but I mean it, politically and most of all economically. And China now has, an economy that very much competes with the U.S. economy and could potentially surpass it in the coming years. And because of that, it's not just about making money for the arms dealers and the defense contractors. It's a more kind of a broader, more long-term strategic objective to maintain U.S. supremacy. Possibly at any cost, even if that means risking a war with China, a nuclear war with China. So yeah, I mean, I wish it seems to me that this is something that all Americans, never mind all people around the world, should be very concerned about. But of course, just going back to what I was saying earlier, I mean, it's not so much that the people that support this type of future are constantly going on TV and putting out their argument for why we have no choice but to go to war with China or go to war with Russia or whatever it may be. It's that they don't even need to go on TV and make these arguments. I mean, that's the dark reality that we face. And, it's why I'm grateful and why I have some glimpse of hope, meeting people like you and being able to do stuff with the John Quincy Adams Society and the Quincy Institute, and a lot of these groups that have either just founded or been revived in recent years in response to the war on terror, in response to this militaristic culture and politics that I'm talking about. So, yeah, I mean, the goal just needs to be, at this point, like to force an actual debate. To some degree, you're starting to have a debate in Congress and among political elites, but I don't think it's reached a point where the majority of Americans are really paying attention. There is, it is encouraging. You do have on both the right and the left, you do have kind of anti-war factions now. You have progressives on the left, and then you have, interestingly, on the kind of the far right, you also have, for their own reasons, some dissent when it comes to the foreign policy status quo. But I don't think it's come nearly to reaching the level it needs to reach in order to really turn the ship around. But I mean, I wouldn't be doing what I was doing if I didn't totally lose hope.
I completely agree. I want to make sure we get to some of our audience questions as well. You mentioned a little earlier about the concept of special forces and the role that they increasingly serve, in even these over the horizon strikes, just, kind of always being present, even when there's a less official or visible American presence. Are there any voices from the special forces community that might be talking about meaningful or at least preferable ways to pursue, these types of programs if they are relatively inevitable, or just anyone you'd recommend listening to on that subject?
I mean, I'm not the person to go to when it comes to like how to do war better. I feel like the problem, with the world we live in, isn't that we don't have enough smart people that are trying to figure out how to do war better. I think we don't have enough people that are genuinely committed to moving toward a world without war, or at least without the constant war, and also the power relations, these imperialist or neo-colonial dynamics that I'm talking about. So I kind of see myself as fulfilling that role. I'm not particularly hopeful about any kind of, special forces use around the world. I think I am not familiar with many examples, or really any examples at all in recent history where a special forces presence has ended up fulfilling the stated objectives of political officials. Usually when special forces land somewhere, they end up causing a lot of havoc. They end up turning people against them, or they end up destabilizing the politics of that area. Again, I mean, I would just encourage everyone to study up more on the US and also European presence. And unfortunately, even the Chinese, it's more economic than military. But I believe there was a piece the other day about the new scramble for Africa. For those of you who might not know, this is a reference to the late 19th century scramble for Africa, which was a very kind of blunt, obvious form of imperialist competition. But we're now seeing a kind of more neo-colonial 21st century version of the same thing. I mean, it's very different in a lot of ways, but it could potentially lead to a lot of the same, long-term horrors that the original scramble for Africa led to. So, when you ask me, is there a way we can use special forces better or smarter? I think the problem is this assumption that if we just get enough smart people in the room, we can find a way to do this the smart way. And no, I mean, to me, it's the actual ends to which these special forces are always being used. And the end itself is what we need to be interrogating. The end is very much about enforcing, maintaining, expanding these social relations, these power relations, these relations of wealth to poverty. And as long as those relations persist, we're going to continue to have a lot of injustice, and we're also going to continue to have a lot of backlash, a lot of blowback, because people don't like being dominated. I mean, the whole history of Al-Qaeda itself is, and radical Islam is a history of blowback. It's a response to U.S. and European violence and oppression in the Muslim world and the greater Middle East. It's also, by the way, a natural trajectory of Cold War policy, where the U.S. was both causing a lot of havoc among Muslims throughout the greater Middle East, while also deliberately arming a lot of the what the government calls radical Islamists, whether it's what became Al-Qaeda or what became the Taliban, for that matter. In Hamas, Israel was, a lot of people don't realize, Israel was supporting what would become Hamas. And they were all doing this as a counterweight to communists, to secular radicals in the Muslim world and the Arab world. And I just see, when I see what's going on in Africa right now, and I keep emphasizing Africa because I think it's one part of all this that is often missed. It just seems like we're repeating the script.
Absolutely. I think I especially agree on, the lack of attention being paid to Africa relative to how important it is to this new, especially Cold War dynamic with, the Russian interference and Africa Act and similar things. You've mentioned a whole lot of really great writers, particularly pertaining to Afghanistan. But are there any other sort of specific articles or writers on some of these larger sort of grand strategy overall that you'd really recommend that people read and check out? Any articles in particular or writers that you just recommend that people follow?
Yeah, I would definitely. He's not on Twitter, but Aziz Rana. He wrote a great book called Two Faces of American Freedom, which is just a great history of the United States, and particularly the role that settler colonialism has played and the kind of the afterlives of the original kind of settler colonization of the frontier. But he also happens to be a very kind of nuanced, rigorous thinker when it comes to building a more, he's a progressive like myself. So building a more kind of progressive infrastructure and progressive foreign policy and what that requires. And he's engaged directly with both the moral and strategic dimensions of the war in Ukraine and the increasing tensions with China. So he's not afraid to really ask the tough questions. So he's definitely someone I would recommend. I'm sure most of the people who are listening to me know who Stephen Wertheim is. I think he does a lot of good work. I think obviously the Quincy Institute, a lot of people at the Carnegie Endowment now are putting out a lot of important reports. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, actually, surprisingly, the Rand Corporation just came out with a really important report, just kind of providing a a broad framework for bringing the war to an end in a way that the Ukrainians can accept. So I would encourage people to look out for that report. I'm trying to think. I could probably name another 100 people, but I'm sure the audience wouldn't appreciate that. But feel free, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm more than willing to pass more names your way.
And of course, your book as well. Weakness leaving the body is.
I guess. I guess I should do the whole like holding it up thing. I always forget. It's not backwards for you guys, right? It's not,
you nailed it.
It's good. Okay. So yeah, this is the book, Pain is Weakness Leaving the Body. Buy it, read it, review it. I'm not very good at selling my own book, but I still try. Just otherwise, the agent and publicist would get upset with me. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one final question, for our audience of a lot of young people, what's one piece of advice that you'd give to students, just today, people who are kind of coming into the professional space now or soon? What would be your advice for them as they kind of enter this new world?
I would, in keeping with a lot of what I'm saying, I would encourage young people to try to resist this constant urge to debate like the hottest issue of the moment, or the most popular debate or popular discussion of the moment, and really think long-term and ask the long-term, radical questions. And I use the word radical, in reference to its root. I mean, it literally means, it comes from, the root. It means root, like the root of the question. So really, deal with like the real fundamental questions about like, what kind of world do I want to live in? And how is the best way to get closer to that world? And just constantly ask yourself those two questions, and then do the research and the study that, avails itself once you're constantly keeping those two questions in mind. And I think, at some point, if you do enough study, if you do enough thinking, you realize that like, it's not real, like the personalities matter like day to day, but at the end of the day, what really matters is the overarching structures and systems. I use these words a lot because they're so important. So like I don't think you can talk about US foreign policy without talking about capitalism. I don't think you can talk about US politics without talking about slavery and its afterlives. Or indigenous genocide and its afterlives. And if the more you have an understanding of these things, the less inclined you are to keep on repeating and in fact exacerbating the very harms that we all agree we're trying to escape.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to our guests for joining us, and thank you to everyone for attending. This has been another digital discussion with the John Quincy Adams Society. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you.